This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
My name is Zahi O'Kelly and I'm the chair of the UK group here in the Institute. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome an old friend, Philip Stevens. Philip is he's a historian by training. He's a former political editor of the Financial Times, was a very important commentator in Britain for very, very many years, very well clued into politics and understands politics. And his latest book is These Divided Isles. I notice it's for sale at the back down there. I'd advise you all to buy a copy. It's one of the finest books on British-Irish relations I've ever read. And he's particularly well equipped because his mother came from Kiltimagh. And he spent most of his summers as a child in Kiltimagh. And he still has cousins there. And he actually launched his book in Kiltimagh over the weekend. But at the same time, he's been part of the elite, if you want to put it that way, in London for very, very many years. And he has a unique perspective, I think, on the relationships between Britain and Ireland. The book is a very important one. It's a very important one about how those relationships developed or didn't develop over the last 100 years. And then he has quite a lot to say about how the future might be addressed. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Philip Stevens. Philip.
Dahi, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I have been here once before, and I think I was speaking about Europe, and it was pre-referendum, so I'm sure I got it completely wrong. I certainly didn't predict the outcome of the referendum. As Dahi said, I sort of trained as a historian, and then I spent 30 or 40 years in journalism, had a wonderful time at the Financial Times, managed to do some great jobs there. But I always slightly regarded myself as an accidental journalist and a failed historian because I'd started a PhD in history and then lost my nerve and then gave it up. So I decided a few years ago that actually I was going to be a historian. So this is what I'm trying to do now, and this is the second in what I hope will be a series of books about Britain in the 20th century and particularly its international relations. This one, of course, though, is the special one, because as Dahi says, I've always regarded myself as Irish as well as British. I have deeply fond memories of summers spent in Mayo. I'm proud to be able to call myself a culture. Friend in Dublin many years ago, and I said, "Well, what meaning do you give to a culture?" And he said, well, it's people who come up from the country still with the hay in their hair. So I come to you with hay in my hair. But this book is personal, and the aim is to try to, as someone who regarded themselves as British and Irish, the thing that always sort of puzzled and one would think about was the fact that here's a relationship built on deep enmity, the fact that, Britain treated Ireland and was the colonial power in Ireland for 7 centuries or so, and treated it at times with a cruelty that it didn't actually show in most other places in the empire, and an indifference and callousness which we saw during famine, where the British elites, policymakers just turned their backs. But also it's a relationship of great complexity and our fortunes over the centuries and more recently have been intertwined and intermingled. So there's been enmity and intimacy at the same time. And so I thought I would try and look at the past century rather than go back over the long history and say, one, understand it myself, to hopefully write a book that tries to explain it to others. It's not a book. I did a lot of research and work on the book, but it's not one directed at academics. I hope it will be read by just interested folk in all walks of life, and as I say, make some sense of that intertwining. And one of the stories I tell in the book is of the head of, until last month, of MI6 or SIS, the James Bond Secret Service, a chap called Richard Moore, who happens to be a friend, and he was appointed in 2020, a century really beyond partition. And in 1920, his grandfather was fighting the British in Cork, attached to a De Valera's command post, De Valera having returned by then from New York. So there you have the head of Britain's most secret intelligence service, grandson of someone who at the time was regarded as a terrorist rather than a freedom fighter. And that sort of interconnection and that interwoven nature, and obviously the diaspora. My mother was part of the huge diaspora coming to England in the 40s and 50s. So that was it. That was the idea of the book. I start with Partition, and I'm not going to go through the history because you all know it better than I do, but I have drawn, I hope, two lessons, messages from Partition and what followed, which I hope were relevant to the way we look at the future as well, because my view is that both Britain and Ireland misunderstood Partition. By that I mean that my initial view before I started reading all the papers and the speeches and the documents was that Partition was a sort of act of vindictiveness by the British, who wanted to hold on to what they could as they were forced out of Ireland by the IRA. But actually, Partition for the British was part of their escape route. By 1921, it's clear from all the internal as well as external conversations, Britain had one objective, which was to get out of Ireland. The Irish question had haunted British politics for decades. Most British politicians had learned that politically and during the Revolutionary War, militarily, they couldn't stay. So the aim was to get out. And that was the overriding objective all the way through the negotiations. There was one condition, and that was that getting out did not undermine the rest of the empire. That Ireland didn't become an excuse for India in particular, but also Egypt and others in the empire to break. So hence the emphasis all the way through on Ireland retaining dominion status, remaining in the Commonwealth. And that was the red line. Partition was something not that the British wanted, but it was actually something forced on the British by the Unionists. And the government then and Lloyd George and Churchill had been in the government in 1912 when you see in effect a Unionist insurrection against Home Rule in the North. And they had realized, or they had come to believe, that they couldn't get out unless the Unionists were given some of the territory of Ulster to run by themselves. They didn't actually think it was going to last forever. The expectation was that partition over time would give way to United Ireland, but that would be someone else's problem because Britain would be gone. And from that driving motivation flowed everything else for Britain, which was, we're out, and now we can just forget about Northern Ireland. So the following decades, and of course the war was an interruption, but essentially the British view of Northern Ireland for the following decades was, it's nothing to do with us. The Irish question is no longer going to torment our politics. So by the time you get to 1967, when James Callaghan, who was the Chancellor, is forced to resign from the Treasury because of devaluation, and he goes along to the Home Office where he's been appointed by Harold Wilson, and he's told that one of his responsibilities is Northern Ireland as Home Secretary. And he inquires as to who in the department looks after Northern Ireland, and he's told, well, nobody really. Northern Ireland's affairs within the department are handled by the General Affairs Department of the Home Office, which he then discovers consists of about 6 or 7 officials, whose other responsibilities include things like application of the licensing laws, road traffic management, and a few other municipal responsibilities. So there, I think you have in summary the British view. And that, of course, was a terrible mistake in that it meant that the British had just looked the other way as unionism had entrenched its power, spread its power, and basically oppressed the nationalist minority in the north. But I would also argue that the Free State and then the Republic also misunderstood partition, because, and the Civil War, well, no, Civil War wasn't put up, but for De Valera certainly, and the governments that followed, partition was an act imposed by the British, and therefore Irish unity would be bestowed simply by the British leaving. So Britain had partitioned Ireland. If Britain left, then you'd have a united Ireland. So this put no responsibility on the Free State, then the Republic, to pay much attention itself to Northern Ireland, and indeed it didn't. There were, through the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, nationalists in the north sought closer relations. I mean, at one point they sought seats in the Dáil, but then other points, closer relations with the Republic, and they were rebuffed. And if Callaghan discovered that the British government knew very little about the North on the eve of the sort of outbreak of the civil rights movement and then the Troubles, it was much the same in Dublin. There was very, very little known. And in a way, partition allowed De Valera to build the sort of Ireland that he wanted, a conservative, inward-looking, I would say something autarkic, rural, infused with Catholicism state, which could separate itself from Britain. So what you saw, I think, in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s was basically the government in Dublin handing ammunition to unionism when the unionists said, look, the Republic is a threat to our identity, our religion, our freedom. So that neglect, I think, was a precursor, one of the precursors to the Troubles, because, as I say, both countries then had stood back and allowed unionism to dominate, and Catholic nationalist grievance to fester in the north. Once the Troubles had started, the British reaction was simply to say, well, it's got nothing to do with anyone else. This is British sovereign territory, and we will deal with it as a security matter. And the initial Irish reaction was, well, this means we need to get rid of the border. The beginning, I think, of wisdom, as it were, on both sides, was when began to come with Sunningdale, but then that was wiped out, but came again with the Anglo-Irish Agreement when the British finally realized that the governance of Northern Ireland had to be something of a joint enterprise with the Republic. The Anglo-Irish Agreement, of course, only allowed consultation, but it was a unique constitutional change for Britain. It basically accepted that Margaret Thatcher had once said that Northern Ireland was just like her constituency of Finchley. The Anglo-Irish Agreement, which she signed, said no, not at all, because no foreign state had any say or right to be consulted on what happened in Finchley. And on the other side, we saw the Republic say, actually, Irish unity isn't just about the British getting out. Indeed, the Irish greatly feared during the 70s that Harold Wilson, who wanted to take Britain out, would actually do so. But the Irish side agreed that actually Irish unity was about the consent of the people of Northern Ireland, including the Unionists. So there was that, I think, fundamental change which we saw the beginnings of in the Sunningdale agreements, the hard beginnings in terms of treaty, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and then the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement, that Northern Ireland, or the governance of Northern Ireland, is a joint enterprise. And that's where I think this is relevant for today, because I think there's a danger that Britain on the one side simply reverts to the "it's nothing to do with us" stance towards Northern Ireland. We had the Good Friday Agreement. There's a mechanism there. You know, if they want unity, it's all there written down. They can have their referendums, north and south, and we'll let them sort it out. I think there's a danger on the Irish side of reverting to this idea that Irish unity is just about the British leaving and the border being dismantled. And for me, at least, Irish unity will be about removing the border of the mind rather than the physical border between north and south. I mean, it seems to me it's very easy to map the path to a united Ireland in terms of demography takes its course, the economic integration moves forward, and eventually you get a sort of beginnings of a majority in the north for unity, and the emotional pull in the south of unity carries sway there, and Ireland, north and south, votes for Irish unity. That does not seem to me to be necessarily a recipe for a successful united Ireland. And, you know, I think that one should be, you know, if you want a united Ireland, you want it to be a success. And I think a 52-48 or 54-46 vote in the north and a 2/3 vote in the south for Irish unity would be more likely a recipe for constant upheaval, if not conflict, than a successful state. So what I don't see in the South, apart from among some think tanks and others, is any serious conversation about what does an island, what does 32 county Ireland look like constitutionally, socially, economically? How does a state which has 800,000 perhaps people who identify as British rather than Irish function in a way that allows unity within the state, but also parity of esteem for that identity? And I have seen, I mean, I know that Mr. Varadkar said a couple of years ago, let's stop talking about a united Ireland as an aspiration and start talking about it as a goal. And if you talk about it as a goal, then you do have to start thinking about the political, economic, and social superstructures. But I don't see that that's happened. Sinn Féin, as far as I can see, basically doesn't want to get into the question at all. And it reminds me of the position that the Brexiters took before the 2016 referendum, which was, we need to get out, and we can argue about what happens next after we've done so. And I really think that would be potentially disastrous if that sort of reflex would happen in Ireland. The one thing I would say is that it won't be like Germany, and it can't be like Germany. And a number of people, my visits here in recent years, have said to me, well, you know, Germany united. And my response is, well, yes, but Germany didn't have 800,000, East Germany didn't have 800,000 people who said that they were Russian, not German. And so what I think, you know, as I said, that we got peace in Northern Ireland when Britain and Ireland finally agreed that this is a joint project, that we must manage it, governance together. We'll get a successful united Ireland only if Britain and Ireland manage it as a joint problem. Britain in providing assurance for the unionist or British community, in also collaborating and cooperating in what would be a colossal enterprise in terms of merging the economies, the health and welfare and other systems of the two states, but also politically and culturally. Now, it seems to me it's perfectly doable and perfectly sensible objective to follow, but not on the basis of a sort of, you know, the vote on a particular day, and not on an arithmetical. Researching the book, I came across some, I can't remember, a bunch of essays by someone called Hubert Butler, who and they were published he wrote them in the 1950s, and they were published in a little volume in the 1990s so I think it's called Grandmother and Wolf Tone. And there's a lovely essay in that refers to partition as a wound, and with a plaster over it. And it says that what you really need is that over time, the border will become irrelevant. It'll become irrelevant economically, socially, politically, and until it reaches such a point where the plaster floats off of its own accord, as it might if you stepped into a bath with a plaster on. And that was the way to get Irish unity. The implication being the last thing you should try and do is to rip off the plaster while the wound isn't healed. And if you go to the north of Ireland now, it's pretty obvious that the wound has yet to heal. So I would say, if I had to guess, I would say there will be United Ireland. If I had to hope, I'd say I hope it takes quite a long time. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.